The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted like failure. It settled on everything, a fine, gritty powder that coated the unpainted clapboard buildings and clung to the souls of the men who lingered there. It was a place where hope came to die, ground under the heel of a railroad spike and the relentless westward push of progress. Jedediah felt the grit between his teeth, a familiar and unwelcome sensation. He stood in the shadows of the blacksmith's lean-to, a ghost in buckskin, his presence as unremarkable as a stray dog. That was how he wanted it. He had come down from his mountain for salt, flour, and coffee, a journey he made only when necessity clawed at him. The town was a sore on the land, a festering wound of noise and greed that chafed his spirit. He endured it for the supplies, his gaze perpetually fixed on the distant, jagged peaks that were his only true home. But today, the usual din of commerce was different. A crowd had gathered in the sun-baked square, their murmurs a low, ugly hum, like flies on a carcass. At the center of the crowd, on the raw timber porch of the Land and Title Office, stood Silas Thorne. Thorne was a man built of soft living and hard bargains, his waistcoat tight across a prosperous belly. He was an agent for the Transcontinental Railroad, a position that gave him the power of a petty king in these forgotten territories. Beside him stood a girl. She could not have been more than 18, her frame so slight it seemed a strong wind might carry her away. Her dress was a threadbare calico, patched and faded, and her hair, the color of autumn wheat, was pulled back in a severe knot that did nothing to hide the stark terror in her eyes. Jedediah's heart, a frozen, dormant thing, gave a painful lurch. He saw the tremor in her hands, clasped tightly before her. He saw the way she flinched when Thorne's voice, slick with false bonhomie, boomed over the crowd. Thorne was holding a piece of paper, a document he waved like a banner of conquest. It was an indenture contract, he explained. The girl's former master, a surveyor, had died owing the railroad a considerable sum. His only asset of value, he declared with a sickening smile, was the remainder of this girl's service. A cold fire began to smolder in Jedediah's gut. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself to feel in 5 long years, not since the fire that had taken everything. He had buried his heart on that mountainside with his wife, Sarah, and his little boy, Caleb. He had sworn it would remain there, locked away from the pain of the world. But as he watched the girl, whose name he did not know, stand there like livestock, he felt the ice around that buried heart begin to crack. He saw Sarah's defiance in the subtle lift of the girl's chin, even as a tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Thorne began the bidding. It was not a true auction, but a spectacle of humiliation, a demonstration of his power. He was not selling her service, he was selling her soul for pocket change. $5, the grimy prospector called out, his eyes crawling over the girl with a predatory gleam. The crowd snickered. Another man, a saloon owner with greasy hair, bid $3. Thorne laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. He wanted to make a point, to show how little she was worth. "We are clearing a debt, gentlemen, not turning a profit. Let us be swift. $1. Who will give me $1 for this fine, hard-working specimen?" Silence fell. The price was an insult, a final degradation. Even the most callous onlookers seemed to shrink from the sheer cruelty of it. The girl, Ilara, closed her eyes. Her world had narrowed to the suffocating heat, the stench of sweat and cheap whiskey, and the chilling finality of that single silver coin. She prayed for the earth to open and swallow her. She felt her spirit detaching, floating away from the shell of her body that was being bartered for less than the price of a shovel. This was the end. From the shadows, a voice cut through the silence. It was low and rough, like stones rolling downhill, yet it carried an authority that made every head turn. "Stop!" Jedediah stepped out of the shade, moving from shadow into the stark, unforgiving sunlight. He was tall and broad, his buckskins worn and weathered to the color of the earth itself. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, deep-set and shadowed by a life of solitude and sorrow, held a light that was both ancient and dangerous. He looked at no one but Thorne. Thorne's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "We have a bidder?" "State your price, friend." "The current offer stands at $1. Jedediah did not look at the girl. He could not. If he did, the fragile dam holding back 5 years of grief would shatter completely. He kept his gaze locked on the railroad agent, a predator fixing its eyes on its rival. He took 3 slow, deliberate steps forward, the crowd parting before him as if he were a force of nature. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a single, heavy silver dollar. The coin glinted in the sun. He walked directly to the porch steps, never breaking eye contact with Thorne. The railroad agent's condescension was curdling into confusion, then alarm. This was not part of his script. This silent, imposing mountain man was an unpredictable element. "I will take the contract," Jedediah said, his voice flat and final. He tossed the coin onto the dusty planks of the porch. It landed with a stark, metallic clang that echoed in the sudden, profound silence. The sound was a punctuation mark, an end to one sentence and the beginning of another. Thorne blinked, recovering his composure. He bent to scoop up the coin, his lips twisting into a smirk. "Sold, then. To the mysterious mountain man. She is all yours." A strong back, I am sure. He gestured dismissively toward Ilara, as if handing over a parcel. "Do with her as you will." Jedediah ignored him. He turned his head for the first time and looked at the girl. Her eyes were wide, a mixture of terror and disbelief swirling in their blue depths. He saw not an object, not a contract, not a debt, but a person. A life. And in that moment, the lie formed on his lips, a shield forged in the fires of his own past tragedy. It was a desperate, mad gambit, but it was the only weapon he had. He took another step forward, placing himself between her and Thorne, between her and the leering crowd. He leveled a look at the railroad agent, a look that promised a world of pain if he was contradicted. The words came out, a guttural roar that ripped from his soul. "That is my wife." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thorne's jaw dropped. The lie was audacious, impossible, yet delivered with such ferocious certainty that it momentarily stunned everyone into believing it. Jedediah did not wait for a response. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently, firmly, taking Ilara's arm. Her skin was cold as ice. She flinched but did not pull away. "We are leaving," he said, his voice now a low command meant only for her. He led her down the steps, his body a solid wall protecting her from the stunned, curious stares. He did not look back at Thorne, who was sputtering, the signed indenture contract still clutched in his hand. Jedediah knew this was not over. He had not solved a problem, he had merely claimed it as his own. He led his newly bought, newly named wife toward the path that led up into the high, lonely mountains, walking away from the town and into an unknown and perilous future. The journey up the mountain was a silent trial. Ilara walked behind him, her feet stumbling on the loose scree of the winding path. The man, this stranger who called himself her husband, moved with an unnerving, fluid grace. He did not speak, did not look back. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on stone and the sighing of the wind through the pines. Fear was a cold stone in Ilara's stomach. She had been saved from one monster only to be claimed by another. What kind of man lived alone in these desolate peaks? What did he want from her? The word he had used in the town, wife, echoed in her mind, each repetition a fresh spike of terror. Jedediah was acutely aware of her presence behind him. He could hear the soft, ragged catch of her breath, the slight scrape of her worn shoes. Every sound was an accusation. He had acted on an impulse he did not understand, a protective instinct he thought had died and been buried long ago. Now, the reality of his actions settled upon him, heavy as a shroud. He had brought this terrified girl into his solitude. He had bound her to him with a lie. He did not know what to do with her any more than he knew what to do with the resurrected ghost of his own conscience. The path grew steeper, and the air thinned, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine and cold rock. This was his world, a world of silence and memory. He was bringing a stranger into its heart. They reached his cabin just as the sun began to dip below the western ridges, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The cabin was small, built of sturdy, axe-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a roof of packed earth and sod. It was a shelter, not a home. A place to exist, not to live. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign he had banked the fire before leaving that morning. He pushed open the heavy plank door and stood aside, gesturing for her to enter. Ilara hesitated on the threshold. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint, rosy glow of the embers in the hearth. She could make out a simple cot, a rough-hewn table with a single stool, and shelves holding a few tin plates and supplies. It was the sparse, lonely dwelling of a man who expected nothing from the world. Swallowing her fear, she stepped inside. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. It was a clean smell, a comforting smell. Jedediah entered behind her, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. He moved to the hearth without a word, adding a few split logs to the embers. Flames licked up, casting flickering shadows across the room and chasing the gloom into the corners. The sudden light and warmth were a small mercy. Ilara stood awkwardly by the door, clutching her arms, unsure of where to look or what to do. He turned from the fire, his face half in shadow. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the auction. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the fine tremor that still ran through her. He saw the raw fear she was trying so desperately to conceal behind a mask of stoicism. She was not Sarah. She was a child, frightened and alone. And he was responsible for her? The weight of it was immense. "You can sit," he said, his voice softer than before. He gestured to the stool. Ilara moved slowly, cautiously, and sat down at the table. She kept her hands clasped in her lap, her back ramrod straight. Jedediah busied himself, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of long habit. He took a tin pot from a hook, filled it with water from a bucket, and set it on a trivet over the fire. He sliced bread from a dark loaf and put a piece, along with a chunk of cheese, on a tin plate. He set the plate on the table in front of her. It was the first act of unsolicited kindness she had received in years. Her eyes welled with tears she refused to let fall. "Eat," he said. It was not a command, but a quiet suggestion. Her stomach growled, betraying her. She picked up the bread with a trembling hand, her hunger warring with her fear. She took a small bite. It was dense and hearty. The cheese was sharp. It was the best food she had tasted in memory. She ate slowly at first, then with a growing urgency, not realizing how starved she was until the food was in her mouth. Jedediah watched her for a moment, then turned away to give her a semblance of privacy. He poured hot water into 2 mugs, adding a pinch of dried mint leaves to each. He set one mug before her. The steam rose, carrying the clean scent of mint. She wrapped her cold hands around the warm tin, the simple heat a profound comfort. He did not eat. He took his own mug and retreated to the shadows near the hearth, leaning against the rough stone. They sat in silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. The cabin, which had at first felt like a trap, began to feel like a sanctuary. The warmth, the food, the quiet, it was a world away from the dust and cruelty of the town below. After she finished eating, Ilara did not know what was expected of her. She looked at the single cot, covered with a thick fur pelt. A fresh wave of fear washed over her. The man seemed to sense her thoughts. "That is yours," he said, nodding toward the cot. "You sleep there." "And you," she whispered, the first word she had spoken to him. Her voice was hoarse. "I will be here," he gestured to the floor by the fire. He pulled a rolled-up bearskin from under the cot and spread it on the floorboards. It was a clear, unspoken promise. He was giving her the bed. He was giving her space. He was giving her safety. Ilara looked from the cot to the man by the fire. His face was unreadable in the flickering light, but his action spoke louder than any words. He had fed her. He had given her warmth. He was offering her his bed while he slept on the hard floor. He had saved her from Thorn, and he was not acting like a man who had just purchased property. He was acting like a guardian. Section she lay down on the cot, pulling the heavy fur over her. It smelled of pine and cold air, the scent of the mountain itself. She was exhausted, yet her mind raced. She watched his silhouette as he sat staring into the flames, a solitary, brooding figure. He seemed as lost as she was. For the first time in a very long time, a flicker of something other than fear ignited within her. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. It was hope. Jedediah sat by the fire long after the girl's breathing had deepened into the slow, even rhythm of sleep. The lie he had told echoed in the quiet cabin. Wife. The word was a knife in his heart. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small, smooth piece of wood worn from years of being held. It was a little bird, crudely carved, its wings half spread. Caleb's bird. His son had been carving it the day the raiders came. The day the fire took everything. He closed his fist around the wooden bird, the memory of physical agony. He had built this cabin with his own hands, for Sarah. He had cleared the small plot of land for a garden. He had dreamed of a life here, a dynasty of his own, rooted in the strength of the mountains. All that had turned to ash. He had survived, but he had not lived. He had existed, a hollow man in a hollow home, guarding a tomb of memories. Now, this girl slept in Sarah's bed. This stranger, this complication he had dragged into his perfectly ordered grief. A fierce, protective anger surged through him. It was not directed at her, but at Thorn, at the town, at a world that could be so cruel. And beneath the anger was something else, something terrifying. It was the flicker of purpose. The girl sleeping on the cot was not just a reminder of what he had lost, she was a reason to fight for what could still be saved. He held the wooden bird until his knuckles were white, the ghost of his past warring with the needs of the present. The fire burned low, and in the deep, silent dark of the mountain, Jedediah kept watch. A week passed in quiet rhythm. Elara slowly shed her fear like a snake shedding its skin. Jedediah was a creature of routine and silence. He rose before the sun, tended to his snares, chopped wood, and worked on tanning a deer hide stretched across a frame behind the cabin. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were few and practical. Yet, his silence was not menacing, it was a deep, settled thing, like the mountain itself. His kindness was shown in actions, not words. A bowl of hot stew left on the table for her. A fresh pail of water brought from the spring each morning. A small, intricately woven basket of pine needles he had made, left on the cot for her to keep her few belongings in. She, in turn, found her own rhythm. She cleaned the small cabin, mended the tear in her dress with a needle and thread she found in a wooden box, and learned to bake a passable version of his dense, dark bread in the embers of the hearth. She began to explore the small clearing around the cabin, discovering patches of wild berries and edible greens. She felt a sense of peace she had never known, a safety that was as solid and real as the stone chimney of the cabin. She began to see the man not as a captor, but as a reluctant guardian. She still did not know his name. He had never offered it, and she was too timid to ask. The fragile peace was shattered when the supplies ran low. Jedediah knew he had to return to Redemption Gulch. The thought of it filled him with a cold dread. He was no longer an anonymous ghost. He was the man who had claimed another man's property with a lie. Silas Thorn would not have forgotten. Thorn was a man whose pride was as vast as his greed. "I am going down to the town," he said one morning, his voice gruff. Elara looked up from the shirt she was mending for him. Fear instantly clouded her face. The town meant Thorn. It meant the leering faces and the humiliation. "You will stay here. Bolt the door. Do not open it for anyone." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She watched him sling a rifle over his shoulder and stride down the path, disappearing into the thick pines. The silence he left behind was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with apprehension. Jedediah's descent into Redemption Gulch was tense. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him as he tethered his pack mule outside the general store. Men stopped talking as he passed. Women pulled their children closer. He was an anomaly, a wild man who had disrupted the town's ugly equilibrium. He ignored them all, his face a granite mask, and pushed open the door to the mercantile. The store was run by Martha, a widow in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and hands that were never still. She was the town's unofficial matriarch, its conscience, and its memory. She looked up from weighing a sack of beans as he entered. "Jedediah," she said, her voice neutral. She was one of the few who knew his name. He had traded pelts with her for years. "Martha," he acknowledged, his voice a low rumble. He handed her his list. Flour. Salt. Coffee. Kerosene. As she gathered the items, she spoke in a low, urgent tone. "You kicked a hornet's nest, you know. Silas Thorne is not a man to be trifled with. He has been all over town, waving that indenture paper and calling you a thief." Jedediah's jaw tightened. The girl was not property. "To him, she is," Martha said, her eyes meeting his. He went to Sheriff Brody. "The law is a tricky thing out here. A piece of paper with a fancy signature can carry more weight than what is right. Brody is holding him off for now, but Thorne is talking about bringing in federal marshals, men paid by the railroad." A cold knot formed in Jedediah's stomach. He had thought his mountain was a fortress. He was wrong. The tendrils of Thorne's power could reach even into his sanctuary. "Thorne is a cheat," Martha continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My husband, before he passed, did some freighting for the railroad. He said Thorne keeps 2 sets of books. One for the company, and a private ledger for himself. He traffics in these indenture contracts, buying them for pennies on the dollar from desperate families back east, then working the poor souls to death or selling them off when they become inconvenient. The man is pure poison. A private ledger." The words hung in the air. A tangible piece of evidence. A weapon. Jedediah's mind, long dormant in the fog of grief, began to work again, sharpening to a fine, dangerous point. He had been reacting, surviving. Now, he had to plan. He had to attack. "Where does he keep this ledger?" Jedediah asked, his voice low and intense. Martha shook her head. "Always with him. In a locked leather satchel. He guards it like a mother bear guards her cubs." She finished packing his supplies. "Be careful, Jedediah. The town is scared of him. They might talk a big game in the saloon, but when it comes to a choice, they will side with the man who signs the paychecks." He paid her, his mind racing. As he loaded the mule, Sheriff Brody approached him. Brody was a decent man, but worn down by the thankless job of keeping a semblance of order in a lawless town. "Jedediah," the sheriff said, his face grim. "Thorne has filed a formal complaint. For theft of property. I need you to bring the girl back." "No," Jedediah said. The word was absolute, unyielding. Brody sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I know what Thorne is. But he has a legal document. I cannot ignore it. He has given me a deadline. 3 days. If the girl is not returned to him by then, he is riding for the territorial judge and a federal warrant. My hands will be tied. 3 days." The threat was no longer distant. It was immediate, a ticking clock counting down to disaster. Jedediah met the sheriff's gaze. 3 days, he repeated, not as a question, but as a statement. He turned without another word, leading the mule back toward the mountain path. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a man running out of time. When he returned to the cabin, Ilara was waiting, her face pale with worry. She unbolted the door at his approach, relief flooding her eyes when she saw it was him. He set the supplies on the table, the weight of the ticking clock pressing down on him. He could not do this alone. Hiding was no longer an option. He needed to fight, and to fight, he needed the one thing he had forsaken, help. "We have 3 days," he said, his voice stark. He told her everything. About Thorne, the sheriff, the threat of federal marshals. He watched her face as he spoke, expecting to see terror. He did see fear, but underneath it, something else was kindling. A spark of defiance. The same spark he had seen in the town square. He has a ledger, Jedediah concluded, telling her what Martha had said. It is the proof of his crimes. But he keeps it with him always. Elara was silent for a long moment, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. When I served the surveyor, she began, her voice barely a whisper, Mr. Abernathy, he would sometimes meet with Mr. Thorne at his office. The office is in the back of the land and title building. Mr. Thorne is a man of habits. Every day, at precisely 3 o'clock, he walks to the saloon for a whiskey. He is never gone for more than 20 minutes. Jedediah stared at her. Her quiet observation, a detail gleaned from a life of servitude, was the key. It was a crack in Thorne's armor. A 20-minute window. It was a fool's chance, but it was the only one they had. "What do we do?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, she was not just a victim. She was a partner. The word we hung in the air, a bond forged in shared peril. First, Jedediah said, a plan beginning to form, we need to win the town. He knew Martha was right. Fear made people compliant. He had to give them a reason to be brave. The next day, they went down the mountain together. It was a statement. Jedediah, the wild mountain man, and the girl he had claimed, walking into the heart of the town not as fugitives, but as members of the community they were about to ask for help. Their first stop was the blacksmith's forge. The smith, a burly man named Gus, was struggling with a broken axle from a large freight wagon, cursing in the heat. Without a word, Jedediah took off his outer shirt, revealing the corded muscles of his arms and back. He picked up the spare sledgehammer, his movements calm and purposeful. "Heat it again," he told Gus. The blacksmith, surprised, did as he was told. When the iron glowed cherry red, Jedediah struck. His blows were not just powerful, they were precise, rhythmic, driving the warped metal back into shape with an expert's touch. Gus joined in, and together, in a ringing chorus of steel on steel, they did in an hour what would have taken Gus half a day. When they were done, Gus wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at Jedediah with newfound respect. "I owe you," Gus said. "I need you to listen," Jedediah replied simply. And he told him about Thorne, about the indenture contracts, about the lie that was the man's entire business. While Jedediah was at the forge, Elara, her heart pounding, walked into Martha's store. The shop was empty save for the owner. Martha smiled warmly at her. "Child, you look better. The mountain air agrees with you." "He is a good man," Elara said, her voice soft but clear. And then, for the first time, she told her story. Not the story of a victim, but the story of her life. Of her parents, lost to fever, of the false promises that led her to indenture, of the quiet dignity she had fought to maintain under years of servitude. She spoke not with self-pity, but with a simple, powerful truth. Martha listened, her expression growing harder with every word. "That man, Thorne," Martha said when Elara had finished, "will not win. Not in my town." The seeds they planted that day began to sprout. Gus the blacksmith spoke to the freighters. Martha spoke to the women who came to her store. The story spread, not as idle gossip, but as a slow-burning fire of indignation. That evening, as Jedediah and Elara prepared to head back up the mountain, the baker's wife pressed a warm loaf of bread into Elara's hands. "For your journey," she said, her eyes kind. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. It was acceptance. That night, the cabin felt different. It was no longer just a shelter, it was a home. A command post. They shared a meal, the silence between them comfortable now, filled with an unspoken understanding. Jedediah found himself watching her as she cleared the plates. She moved with a quiet grace, a resilience shining from within that he had not seen before. She was not a fragile thing to be protected, she was a force in her own right. "My wife," he said, his voice low. She looked up, startled. Her name was Sarah. My son was Caleb. It was the first time he had spoken their names aloud to another soul in 5 years. The words were stones he had carried in his chest, and releasing them was an agony and a relief. He did not say more. He did not have to. Ilara saw the universe of pain in his eyes. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his grief, a sharing of his burden. In that moment of shared vulnerability, the lie he had told in the dust of Redemption Gulch began to feel like a prophecy. The next day, the day before Thorne's deadline, was the day of the gamble. They went down to the town in the afternoon, their plan set. Jedediah positioned himself in the shadows of the alley across from the land and title office. Ilara, her terror masked by a determined calm, walked to the far end of the street, near the saloon. At 3:05, she began to sing. Her voice, at first hesitant, rose into the dusty air. It was a simple, haunting folk ballad, a song of lost love and distant shores. It was a voice of surprising purity and power, filled with a sorrow that was bone-deep and real. Men coming out of the saloon stopped to listen. Women leaned out of windows. The commerce of the town paused, captivated by the raw, beautiful sound. At precisely 3 o'clock, Silas Thorne emerged from his office. He scowled, annoyed by the distraction, but as he walked toward the saloon, his pace slowed. He, like everyone else, was drawn in by the melancholy song. He lingered near the saloon doors, listening, his guard down for just a moment. It was the moment Jedediah needed. He slipped from the alley, a shadow moving with deadly speed. He reached the back door of the land and title office. It was locked, as expected. But Jedediah had spent his life reading the weaknesses in things, in rock, in wood, in men. He found the flaw in the doorframe, put his shoulder to it, and with a single, brutal shove, burst the lock. Inside, the office was neat, orderly. On the desk sat Thorne's locked leather satchel. Time was ticking. Jedediah took a small, sharp tool from his pouch, a blade he used for fine leatherwork. He did not pick the lock, he sliced the hinges off the back of the satchel. He lifted the flap. Inside, beneath a sheaf of official-looking railroad documents, was a small, black, leather-bound book. The ledger. He grabbed it, tucked it inside his shirt, and slipped back out the door, melting into the shadows just as Ilara's song came to its sorrowful conclusion. Thorne, his thirst for whiskey reasserting itself, pushed his way into the saloon. He never knew. The final day arrived, grey and overcast, the sky threatening a storm that mirrored the tension in the town. Sheriff Brody, his face etched with worry, had called a public meeting at the town hall. It was not a formal trial, but a hearing, a place for the town to witness what was to be done. The hall was packed. Farmers, prospectors, merchants, and their wives stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces grim. Silas Thorne stood at the front, smug and confident. He held up the indenture contract, its official seals and florid signatures a testament to his power. The law is the law, he declared, his voice ringing with self-righteousness. This man, this savage from the mountains, has stolen my legal property. He has broken into my office. He is a thief and a ruffian, and he threatens the very order that allows this town to exist. I demand the return of my property and the arrest of this man. All eyes turned to Jedediah, who stood beside Ilara near the opposite wall. He was silent, his face impassive. Sheriff Brody looked at him, his expression pleading. Jedediah? Have you anything to say? Jedediah looked not at the sheriff, but at Ilara. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was her fight, too. She had to find her voice. Ilara stepped forward. She was trembling, but her eyes were fixed on Thorne. I am not property, she said, her voice a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent room. My name is Ilara. I had a family. I had a home. Mr. Thorne's company promised my parents a new life in exchange for my service. They lied. Her voice grew stronger, clearer, infused with the unassailable power of truth. They took everything. My service was not a debt to be paid, it was a prison sentence. Mr. Abernathy worked me until his heart gave out. And Mr. Thorne, he did not see a grieving girl. He saw an asset on a balance sheet. He tried to sell me for $1. She looked around at the faces in the crowd, the women, the mothers. Am I worth only $1? Is any person's life worth so little? A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne's face was turning a blotchy red. Lies and sentiment. The contract is legal, he roared. Your contract is a lie, Jedediah's voice boomed, cutting through Thorne's sputtering. He stepped forward and pulled the black ledger from his shirt. He held it up. But your ledger tells the truth. Thorne's face went white. He lunged for the book, but Gus the blacksmith and 2 other large men stepped in his way, forming a solid wall. Jedediah opened the ledger. This book details every life you have bought and sold, Thorne. It lists the real price of the contracts, bought for pennies from starving families. It lists the names of 3 men and another woman who expired under your care before their terms were met. It is a record not of business, but of slavery and death. He began to read from it. A name. A price. A notation. Elara Vance. Contract purchased for $10. Value listed as 200-inch. He read another. John Miller. Term, 7 years. Deceased, year 3. Cause, exhaustion. Contract voided. No loss. With every name, the mood in the room grew colder, harder. The townspeople were looking at Thorne not with fear but with utter contempt. They were seeing him for what he was, a predator who had fed on the weak and the desperate. Martha stepped forward, her voice ringing with moral authority. This man has preyed on the innocent under the guise of law. We will not have it. Not in our town. Gus the blacksmith pounded a heavy fist on the table. Not in our town. The cry was picked up by others, a rising chorus of defiance that shook the rafters. Not in our town. The community, once cowed and suspicious, had found its conscience. They were no longer a collection of individuals, they were a unified body, and their judgment was absolute. Sheriff Brody looked at the ledger, then at Thorne, who was backed against the wall, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He looked at the faces of his town, united and resolute. The choice was no longer difficult. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking loud in the sudden silence. Silas Thorne, he said, his voice steady and firm, you are under arrest for fraud, for kidnapping, and on suspicion of murder. The defeat of Silas Thorne was swift and total. Stripped of his authority and the fear he wielded, he was just a soft, sputtering man. Sheriff Brody locked him in the town's single jail cell to await the arrival of a territorial judge who, armed with the ledger, would ensure Thorne never preyed on anyone again. The railroad, eager to distance itself from the scandal, nullified all of his outstanding indenture contracts, freeing dozens of people Elara would never meet. As the crowd dispersed, their anger replaced with a quiet sense of communal victory, Jedediah and Elara stood together in the now empty hall. The storm had broken outside, a cleansing rain washing the dust from the streets. He looked at her, at the strength that radiated from her, the dignity she had claimed in front of everyone. You were brave, he said, the words feeling inadequate. We were brave, she corrected him gently. They walked out into the rain-washed town. No one stared. Instead, they were met with nods of respect, with quiet smiles. The baker's wife came out and gave Elara a small sack of sugar cakes. To celebrate, she said. Gus the blacksmith clapped Jedediah on the shoulder. The mountain's not so far away, he said. Come down for a drink sometime. They were no longer outsiders. They were part of the town. The journey back up the mountain was different this time. They walked side by side. The silence was not one of tension or uncertainty, but of peace. The world felt new, washed clean. When they reached the cabin, the air was crisp and clear, and the scent of wet pine filled their lungs. Inside, the fire was burning low. Jedediah added a log, and the flames leaped up, filling the small space with a warm, golden light. He turned to her, the moment he had been dreading and anticipating finally upon them. Elara, he began, his voice rough with emotion. The things I said in the town. About you being my wife. It was a lie to protect you. He looked at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. You are free. Thorn is gone. You can go anywhere you want. I can give you money for a stagecoach ticket, help you get to a real city, find a new life. He was offering her an escape, an honorable way out of the fiction he had created. He was preparing to be alone again, to return to his solitude and his ghosts. Ilara was silent for a long moment. She stepped closer to him, so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her. She reached out and gently took his hand. His was calloused and hard, hers was small but steady. What if the life I want is here? She asked, her voice soft but sure. You called this place a shelter. But for me, it has been a home. You speak of a lie you told, but you have shown me nothing but truth. You have shown me kindness, respect, and courage. She looked around the small, simple cabin. I am not the woman you lost, Jedediah. And you are not the master I fled. We are two people who were saved by a lie. She looked up, and finally, he met her eyes. Hers were shining, not with tears of sorrow, but with a clear, hopeful light. What if we could make it the truth? Jedediah's heart, the frozen, buried thing he had guarded for so long, thawed completely. A wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to bring him to his knees washed over him. He looked at this incredible woman who had faced down her tormentor and offered him, a broken man, a new beginning. He saw not the ghost of Sarah, but the future in Ilara's eyes. He did not speak. He simply tightened his grip on her hand and, with his other, reached into his shirt. He pulled out the small, carved wooden bird. He looked at it for a long moment, a silent farewell to the pain it represented, then placed it gently on the stone mantel of the hearth. It was no longer a symbol of what was lost, but a marker of where a new life began. He turned back to Ilara, his eyes clear. He was home. They both were. Together, in a cabin built for a family lost, a new family, forged by choice and bonded by courage, was about to be born.